And staying with crime in South Africa, nearly 250,000 murders were recorded in South Africa in the last decade. These numbers, you may recall, were shared in a briefing recently, an appearance, in fact, by the Police Minister, Cele. What this means, basically, is that over 27,000 people were killed in the last year alone, with an average of 74 murders a day on that number. Let's talk further about this with the independent crime and policing researcher, David Bruce. A very good evening to you, David. Good to have your time. So we have been talking about these figures ever since Minister Cele first talked about just the high level of murders in this country in that Q&A session with MPs. I wonder, though, if we've adequately managed to adequately make sense of why it is that we're so violent and why taking another person's life seems so common in this country.
Right. Well, thank you and good evening. You're right to express a very serious concern about the scale of the problem in South Africa. One dimension that possibly we need to bring into the picture is that there's quite a big variation in rates of murder between the different provinces. And so currently what we're talking about is a situation where the provinces with the highest rates of murder are the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Western Cape, and Gauteng falls a bit behind that. The other five provinces then, have much lower rates of murder. So the one thing is that, for instance, if we were engaging with this problem and in a much more purposeful way, one of the things that we would bring in the picture is these very substantial variations, in rates of murder, and actually the provinces where murder has been increasing most dramatically over the last few years have been the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. So there's specific aspects of the problem which aren't even being talked about right at this point. And if we were actually grappling with this, we would be focusing much more closely on those kinds of issues.
And why is it, David, do you think that the Eastern Cape and KZN are seeing this increase in the rate of murders? I recall a period earlier this year in KwaZulu-Natal where there appeared to be a surge, for example, in the number of people who were just shot in their cars, families traveling. We were hearing there were some of them believed to have been linked to the drugs trade there. We know in the KZN area there's also the problem around, for example, political killings, but that does not even begin to account for the bigger picture, does it?
Right. So, the general pattern that has been in place for a long time is, continues to prevail. So, to a substantial degree, murders continue to be a phenomenon that take place between people who are known to each other. In fact, something in the region of 87% of murder victims are male. Those include some male children, but the biggest category of murders in terms of the kind of demographics are men between roughly the ages of about let's say something like 17 and about 40 years of age. So a very large proportion of murders involve victims who are people in those categories. And quite a lot of them do involve conflicts between people who are known to each other. Mm. But what also seems to be playing an important role increasingly over recent years is the entrenchment of organized crime. And so many analysts believe that one of the big contributors to the current increases in murder, particularly in a place like KZN, are these the kind of the institutionalization of various forms of organized crime.
Right. And if we're seeing this alarming level of violence among people known to each other, it's also reflected, for example, when you look at the sexual violence statistics in this country, where if you are raped or sexually assaulted, it's likely to be an act committed by someone known to you, right? So a lot of it is in intimate settings, people who know each other. As you're saying, a lot of young people also either victim or perpetrators of these murders. How do we begin to deal with that at this point?
Well, there's, the one, aspect of the problem is simply that we've got to if you listen to, people talking about crime, if you listen to government talking about crime, it often isn't even apparent that there is a substantial problem of murder in South Africa. So, there are various things that we could do from a policing point of view and by intervening in other kinds of ways. But, the first part of it is actually, we need to say as a country, and our government needs to, commit itself in a very serious way to addressing the problem.
You have to wonder,
and basically,
David, based on what you're saying, you do have to wonder why there isn't a sort of coherent murder strategy from the side of government and the police specifically, when you consider that the numbers we're talking about, be it the annual figures that you may look at or over the whole decade, are in fact worse than the number of people killed in some war zones around the world.
Well, that's true. And so, it's often puzzled me and troubled me that, this, serious violence is often not prioritized adequately in responses to crime. So, if you just, obviously what we're talking about in South Africa is there's various dimensions of the crime problem that are, of cause to concern, of a cause of concern to people. And so, but often it seems that, amongst all of these various facets of the crime problem, there isn't any kind of sustained attention to the problem of murder itself and the forms of violence associated with murder. And so, I think, it does really start there. Is we need to. It reflects a kind of normalization of a kind of acceptance that just this kind of loss of life is just a normal part of life in South Africa, and so part of where things need to shift is in terms of us as a country saying that we don't accept that, and we need to develop a society which isn't overshadowed by violence in this way.
Right, and before we came to you, our reporter Zola Sholwana actually put together an update from one of the townships here in Gauteng, where people were saying, in fact, if you live in the township, depending even in the township on where you are in that area, the police response is not the same. And if you live in the suburbs, for example, let's say in a place like Johannesburg, in the northern suburbs, you're likely to have better treatment or better response from the SAPS. How much is that factoring into the rate at which murderers may be getting away with these crimes and how people are feeling increasingly unsafe even in their homes?
Well, you see, I think that policing is one of the issues, and I think there are inconsistencies in, the way in which the police do deal with these problems. But of course, the overall situation is that the scale of crime in the country, in various forms, is potentially just too large a problem. For instance, the investigative resources that the police have are not adequate to the overall problem, and so there's a need for a much more strategic approach from within the policing system to how they allocate their resources and address problem issues to do with how to navigate and negotiate the overall complexity and scale of the crime problem.
Thank you very much for that, David Bruce, independent crime and policing researcher on News at Prime.